An introduction to using Harvard Dataverse and the NIH DMP Harvard Dataverse guidance. Both of the speakers are also part of the CAFE team, and we're leveraging for the CAFE this partnership with Harvard Dataverse for data sharing. So we're excited to hear more about the Harvard Dataverse and how we can use it in this space. The first speaker is going to be Sonia Barboza. She's the Associate Director of Dataverse Support, Data Curation, and the Murray Archive. And it's going to be followed by Julie Goldman, who is a Research Data Services Librarian at the Harvard Medical School. Oh, Sonia.
Thank you. Yes, I'm here. Hello, everyone. How are you? Thank you for joining us. So I'm Sonia, and I'm going to be speaking about the Harvard Dataverse repository, and Julie will chime in and jump in and speak about the NIH data management plan and give you some guidance on how to complete that plan to use the Harvard Dataverse repository. Next slide.
Oh, I don't know. Oh, sorry, Julie.
Somebody's running our slides.
Do you want me to share the slides, Sonia?
Somebody needs to run the slides.
I will run
Sorry.
the slides. No
Thank you, because I need my notes. All right. Today's webinar will focus on the Dataverse repository and best practices for sharing and finding data on the platform. We will have some examples. We will show you the CAFE collection that has been created on the Harvard Dataverse repository, and we will talk about the NIH DMP guidance document that we've developed and is available on our support website. So the Dataverse project is an open source platform. You can go to the next slide, Julie. The Dataverse platform is an open source software platform designed to help researchers and institutions share, preserve, cite, and explore and analyze research data. Metadata is the essential component of the project and helps to provide content and facilitate discovery and reuse of the data. The project has a rich set of metadata fields that can be used to describe research data, including authorship, title, keywords, description, file formats, licensing information, and more. Sharing in this Dataverse repository aims to ensure that the data are high quality, properly documented, organized, and accessible. So the Dataverse software supports comprehensive data sharing. It promotes research data transparency and reproducibility. Easy data deposit by supporting multiple data formats, standardized data deposits, standardized data citation. So you're going to get a DOI that allows researchers to cite and track the use of your data. There are data access controls for restrictions, embargoes, controlled workflows, metadata standards, including Dublin Core, DataCite, and the Dataverse metadata schema to ensure consistency and standardization. There's also the development of data sharing policies. For example, what CAFE has adopted to allow their CAFE project team to share data in their collection space. And of course, there's data discovery, okay? So you can stay right there. Yep, right there. So I talked about the Dataverse being committed to using standard compliant metadata. The metadata can be easily mapped to standard metadata schemas and be exported into JSON format for preservation and interoperability. The design is designed to be flexible, customizable, so that researchers can choose the fields that are most relevant to their data and research. You're going to see that we created a CAFE metadata block specifically for the data that's coming in from this project. And that's one of the custom features that Dataverse provides for metadata support. The metadata is validated and standardized according to best practices and community standards, such as the Data Documentation Initiative. This validation ensures metadata is consistent, interoperable, usable by other systems and researchers. Let's go to the next slide. So there are over 50 features and tools that help you to share your data to meet FAIR when you are using a Dataverse installation. Next slide. So the Dataverse and FAIR. One more slide. Dataverse gives you the tool to move your data towards each principle, making the data findable and discoverable with metadata, persistent identifiers, connections to searchable resources, accessibility that is open and free and yet allows for authorization and authentication when needed, interoperability for analysis, storage, and processing, and data are reusable because they are well described for use in multiple ways. These are the ways that the Dataverse infrastructure supports data, metadata, and tools needed to support the FAIR principles. Next slide. Ensuring FAIR ensures data is shared in ways that maximizes potential for reuse. FAIR is the responsibility of the researcher and the organization as well as the repository, because the repository is going to give you the tools that you need to complete and use in order to move your data towards FAIR. Next slide. So here I'm including how Dataverse supports, we've talked about how Dataverse supports FAIR, and this is the CAFE information that we have here. So as you know, the CAFE aims to build a community of practice by managing and supporting climate change and health research and capacity building efforts. This objective is to aid climate and health community of practices by identifying climate and health research data. Go on to the next slide, please. So here you're going to see the GitHub page on the CAFE data collection, but you're also going to see the CAFE collection page that's created on the Harvard Dataverse repository. And you'll see one sub-collection that we featured in there. There will be additional sub-collections added to support the data from the CAFE project in this space. And there are instructions for how this space can be utilized by your community for data sharing. So what we're going to do is go to the next slide and talk about the Harvard Dataverse repository, because that is where this collection exists, and that's where you're going to be creating your content. So in the Harvard Dataverse repository, you're going to be creating an account, likely depositing your collection as part of the CAFE parent collection, and uploading your files and publishing your data set to that space. Next slide, please. So the purpose of the repository, to keep a certain population of data so that it can be mined for greater insight. R3data.org has the Dataverse project and the Harvard Dataverse repository listed, as well as projects that are using the Harvard Dataverse repository as collection spaces for their data. And please always keep in mind that data should be submitted to discipline-specific, community-recognized repositories when possible. Where a suitable discipline-specific resource does not exist, then you would look at a generalist repository to submit your data. Next slide. So our repository is supported by the Institute for Quantitative Social Science at Harvard University. It is an endowed permanent repository for your data. It was released in 2006 for the use by the worldwide research community for data sharing, but Harvard affiliates in particular get additional storage space and additional support for their data. The intention of the Harvard Dataverse was always to provide a self-curated and managed space for ease of data sharing. All deposits are reviewed to ensure that they meet our data sharing requirements and do not violate the repository policies on sensitive data, regulated data, not being shared on the system at this point. Next slide. So there's always some guidance for preparing your data for sharing in the Harvard repository, which we included here. Okay, you should always determine what's going to be shared, ensure that the metadata describes what is being shared, and that it's clear to your user community who's going to be coming and looking at your data what you have actually made available. You want to choose and organize your content appropriately, and then, of course, share your data. I won't go into the details here. There's lots of details in the slide that you can look at later, mostly because of time constraints that we want to get through to the DMP. But we are giving you some guidance on data formatting, quality control, metadata creation, version control, data documentation, access control, and preservation that you should look at here. Next slide. So we're going to go to creating a collection, depositing data, and uploading files. Next slide. So users of the Harvard Dataverse can create their own project spaces, just like we showed you with the CAFE space that will be shown again later in the slides. That collection space is going to be customized with metadata, searchable facets, and logos to support the research data that's coming in from this project. There's also support for multiple login options, as you can see on this slide, including Shibboleth, GitHub, and Orchid. Okay. Once you create a project space, you'll have access to it forever. That that access doesn't go away. Once you change institutions, you contact us and update your account information to your new login. For organizations that are not linked to Shibboleth, most organizations are, but there is a community called incommon.org, and they provide the integrated service and software solutions that address these single sign-on. So if you are from an organization that does not have that Shibboleth authentication, your organization would need to register with InCommon in order to be used on the Harvard Dataverse for this kind of authenticated login. Okay. And as you can see, your collection has administrators and branding and supports metadata. Now, this is important, for example, because we created a collection. We created a custom metadata block for Cafe. And so in order to create custom metadata blocks, you have to have a collection. And Cafe has instructions about how collections are to be integrated into their existing space. Next slide. So once you have a collection space, it's an arbitrary space that looks really nice and supports your metadata, but this is where all of your research projects and your data sets go. Your data sets are the ones that get your DOI. So as I mentioned before, it's committed, the Dataverse project is committed to using standard compliant metadata to ensure that the metadata can be mapped easily to standard metadata schemas and basically make your content discoverable and findable. So data sets are deposited in the personal Dataverse collection spaces, and they're supported by files, metadata, terms, and licenses, and versioning. All data sets get a standard citation and the DOI. The DOI is provided by the Harvard Dataverse repository, is paid for by the Harvard Library, and the DOI will always come back to your data set. There are over 100 metadata fields to choose from to help you describe your project, and the Harvard Dataverse requires 5 metadata fields to help you build your citation, so you won't be able to bypass those requirements. So we'll need a project title, author, contact, subject, and project description. And then, of course, you can add your author-affiliated identifier schemas to tie to your research affiliations. Data sets also come with a private URL feature that allows authors to share their content prior to publishing. There's a guestbook feature to collect information on how your data are being used by others. There's anonymous peer review and multiple license support that will be added. The actual multiple license support has already been added, and the anonymous peer review is ready and is being added to the production site in the near future, shortly. Next slide, please. So the Dataverse requires data files to be deposited with all data sets. That's one of our policy requirements. We are not just an article indexing platform. Whatever you share here has to be data and has to be reusable data. All file types are supported with additional metadata extraction and data analysis and visualization support for tabular data files. Included are some of the images of the features currently available in Harvard Dataverse, including file level access restrictions, via embargo and restriction features, data analysis and visualization options, metrics, and linking to author research IDs. Permission and access control exists at all levels discussed today: the collection level, the data set level, and the file level. So whenever you make a deposit, ensure that you have data and documentation up in your data set deposit before you publish your content. Next slide. So again, we've talked about several ways to create an account. Pick the one that works best for you. Whenever you need an account update, you just contact us to get an account update. So we've talked about the personal space creations for your, it's one next slide. Thank you. Your collection space, you have the ability to create your collection space, and you can link your collection space across projects on the Harvard Dataverse repository. Cafe has a collection space, and again, they have the instructions on how you can create additional spaces and deposit your data into the Cafe collection that already exists. Next slide. So whenever you're creating a collection, it's going to ask you for some information. Mostly it's going to ask you who you are, what to call your collection, the metadata, and the searchable facets that are going to be used to describe your data. Next slide. And so Dataverse user accounts can be granted roles that define which actions they're allowed to take on specific collections. The Cafe collection has defined some roles. Okay, so you might be able to come in and create a space and publish it, or deposit a data set and publish it, they might have a review workflow at the moment so that they can see what's coming in to ensure it meets their deposit guidelines before your data sets are published, okay? Because they do want to ensure that you're using the metadata blocks that they've created properly and that you're including sufficient information to make your data deposit useful, all right? So these permissions are available again at the collection level, at the data set level, and at the file level for file access. Next slide. All right, so here's an example of a research project space that's utilizing sub-collections and extensive metadata facets. At some point, the cafe collection will look just like this because you're going to have a lot of data, a lot of sub-collections, a lot of searchable facets that will make the discovery of the data easy, and that will show the extent of the different types of data that are being deposited into the space. Okay. Next slide. So here's a deposit of a data set. Now here's where it's really important, okay? Because outside of your collection space that looks really nice and is customized, really the data set is the focus, because the data set is going to ask you to put in a lot of metadata to describe your project. There are some consistent metadata that need to be entered that have been defined by Cafe, and there's also their custom metadata block that has been created that will guide you through what answers they're looking for, what information they're looking for to define your data, okay? So you'll have the ability to put in a draft. It'll probably go through review. The Cafe team will be responsible for publishing the draft or sending it back to you for additional information. And that's all in a workflow that's supported by the repository, okay? Once your data set is published, you do have the ability to come in and edit the data set. And if you edit the data set in this collection that has a submit for review workflow, it will go into review again. The Cafe team will be notified that you've made changes and they'll go in and look at the changes and either publish it or send it back to you for more information, okay? Again, your files can be restricted or embargoed as needed for access. That's very important. I would not put any restricted data, any identifiable data not supported in the Harvard Dataverse. It doesn't have anything to do with Cafe. It's actually the repository that does not support identifiable data, including regulated data, okay? Metadata can be included, and then you'll have to point out to a trusted remote storage for the regulated data are going to reside or the sensitive data are going to reside. Okay, that's all in the workflows that Cafe defines on their page. There's a private URL that if you have a data set and you need to share it with someone before it's published, maybe a journal wants to look at it before it's published, there's a private URL that you can use to share your draft data set so that a journal editor can look at your data set or your project team can look at your data set before it's published, okay? There are embargoes as well. You can move a data set, the files from embargo to restricted or embargo right to open, okay? And versioning. So every time you make a change to your data set and you publish a new version of it, versioning is automatically captured on the back end by Dataverse. There's a tab that will show you the differences, all of the versions, who published it, who made changes, and the differences between different versions of your data, okay? There are metrics, make data count. Of course, cloud storage and computing, cloud storage access. So there's a lot of information that will help support your data set and the use of your data set. Next slide. So again, this is the common metadata that comes with the Dataverse project. Okay, when you create your collection space, you will have an option to select the metadata that supports your project. If you are using the Cafe metadata, they already have some standards that they've defined for the whole Cafe collection. So if you choose not to have a personal collection and you're just depositing a data set, you will have to use the metadata that they've defined for the project. Next. Okay, so we've talked about some custom metadata blocks. This is just giving you some examples of how much metadata, links to topic classifications, keywords, notes, language producers, how much information you can actually put in about your data to make it useful. You're making it discoverable by putting in sufficient metadata, and you're increasing the reusability of your data because you're providing enough information to the people who are coming to look at your data set and see if it's something that they can use, okay? And of course, I've included some information about data citations next. Yeah, we can go. So data sets are made up of files, metadata, terms of access, versioning, and the citation and features that make a data set findable and reusable. We tie all of our metadata to DataCite, which is where people will find your data, right? DataCite is mapping all of the metadata that you put in here and that you share on the Dataverse repository to their schemas, making it more likely that somebody will find your content and your content is searchable on Google. So the Dataverse software provides these standard citations for all data sets: the author, the year, the dataset title, the DOI, the repository name, and versioning. Right? Make Data Count is a project that's in process to collect and standardize metrics on data use, especially views, downloads, and citations. We're going to integrate with more Make Data Count features to collect and display usage metrics, including count of dataset views. You get file downloads and data citations already. You will see some of this in the Files tab of the dataset page. So when you have content that's actually downloaded, you'll be able to see the aggregated count of downloads of your files, and you'll also be able to see the individual files and how many times those individual files have been downloaded. Okay, so there is a formal citation, so you cannot bypass the citation metadata requirements when you deposit your data in this repository. Next. Okay, so we've talked about, connecting your literature to your data set. I'm not going to say more today, right now, just in case you have questions later. Next. And next. Okay, we've talked about the citation quite a bit, so let's go to the next one. Okay, so as we mentioned, your data set's created in draft format when you're published, and published when they are ready to be shared. So you have time to come in here and manage your content with your team. Don't feel pressured to come in, put a data set, and you have to publish it right away. You have time to come in here and manage your project, have your team members look at your data in draft format by giving them access to your data set or your collection space and utilizing that workflow together. Then you have the private URL feature that we talked about, and the private URL is going to allow you to share your project in a draft format. Once you enable a private URL, you just send that link to whoever needs to look at it. They don't need to log in. They can just come in and look at the data that you've shared and give you any feedback, okay? Your data set in draft format will have a reserved DOI. That DOI is not registered until you publish it. So if you delete that draft data set prior to publishing, that DOI is gone, okay? Just so you know how the workflow is on the system. Next. So at the dataset level, you can give permission to a user, a team member, to curate a dataset, to download all of the files if they're a user. Access level decreases from top to bottom, admin to member. At the file level of a dataset, you have more control over who can access certain files. Okay. Next slide, please. So every data set, along with the citation, includes metadata that you filled in and default metadata that the software provides once you hit save when you create a data set. The subject field is required, as well as, and you're going to get along with your metadata, a file page, a metadata page, a terms page, and a versions page, okay? In this case, you can see a red lock next to some of the file names, which indicates this file is restricted for access. And thus, to meet the FAIR guidelines for reusability, the terms page of the dataset has to have information on how that dataset can be accessed by users. So if you think about this in terms of a regulated dataset, right, where somebody might have to contact you or go to another website and fill out a form, that's the kind of information you would also include in the terms page, the license for the data, as well as information on how this dataset can be accessed by someone who should access it, a bona fide researcher or someone in your field who would have access to your data, okay? Next. So Dataverse is made to support any license needed for data sharing. By default, it's CC0, okay? But you can opt out of that license and select any license that you need to meet data sharing requirements. Custom licensing is now a feature. Multiple license support is also a feature. And licensing information also shows up on the data set landing page in the front. So on the front page there, so someone can see the license ahead of time. You can update your license anytime you need. Just remember that. Whoever has access to one license, if that's how they access the data, that's how they're going to use your data. So pick your license carefully. Just because you change a license doesn't mean that people who have previously accessed your data under that previous license won't use it with the authority given by the previous license, okay? Everything can be updated in a data set, but just ensure that what you make available the first time you publish a data set is what you'd like to make available, okay? Next. So here's the versioning. Here's an example of versioning. I'm not actually only showing you one data set, but there are several that have quite a lot of versioning information. As the data set is changed and updated, as metadata is updated, as data files are replaced or data files are deleted and new files are added, you're going to get versioning and different versions of your data. Metadata changes are usually minor versions that only show up on this versions tab. They don't show up in your citation tab. So your citation tab may say version 1 and your versions tab will say version 1.1 or version 1.2. If you change a file in any way, whether you delete it, replace it, it's going to push your dataset citation to a version 2. Major version change, because data files are pertinent. The most important piece of information to changing a data set is the file. Okay, so versioning options are flexible. Some of it can be controlled by you, but not all of it. With the file changes, you're automatically going to get pushed to a major version change. Metadata, you can decide if you made enough changes to have a minor or a major version change. Okay, next slide. So as we said, all types of files are supported, but we encourage the use of open and interoperable file types as often as possible. There's also a number of integrated tools available for you to be used with your files. And I'm giving you some examples of these tools that are demonstrated in here. You're going to see the restricted access workflow to some of the restricted files. You're also going to see a little chat bot. Open Files has this AI integration. We call it Ask the Data. It looks like a little robot's head there. And you can actually go into the data and ask the data a question. And if that information is available in the data set, it'll pull it out for the user. So there's a lot of AI integrations coming in to the software to make data discoverability easier and reusability easier by, if you have a really large file and somebody knows nothing about it, they can ask a question and get an answer to give them some more information about how usable the data are for them. And as you can see, there's a request access when you have a restricted file. You can do two things. You can have custom terms of access where somebody contacts you for accessing the data, or you can use the built-in request access feature. That'll prompt the user, the person who's interested in your data, to create an account and automatically request access. And there's a whole workflow on the back end for you where you can accept or reject a request to use your data. You can also reach out to the person requesting access and ask them more questions about how they plan to use your data. The Brain Genomics data set that I showed earlier, they use a request access. And those authors reach out to their users and ask them what they plan to do with the data before giving them access. Next. File handling, right? We offer additional archival preservation features. So for certain file types, we are going to export, we are going to provide an archival preservable format of the data, where we give you additional information about the file that you're putting in. Can you go to the next slide and we can, yep, right there. So what we have here is tabular files. They were originally CSV files, I believe. They're converted to tabular format upon ingest to the Dataverse. That allows it to work with the Ask the Data AI tool. It also allows a preview of the data files, and it also allows you to download the data in different formats than the original. So if you don't have access to SPSS or Stata or R, then at least you can download the file in a format that's usable for the software that you're using to analyze the data. Okay. Next slide. So this is the Ask the Data tool that we were telling you about. You know, a simple question as, what is this data about? This data is about traffic accidents in the US, just in case you had no clue what it was about. You can ask about gender variables, you can ask about age variables, you can ask about geographic variables. So it's a pretty nifty tool that we are enhancing day by day. Hopefully it'll be at the front of the Harvard Dataverse repository at some point to search all of the data. Next, because I want to leave sufficient time for file previewers. Here's the file previewer. So every time you see the little eye icon, that means that you can preview the file. You can, if it's a numeric data file, you can see the variables and the values and what's in it. If it's an image file, you can see the image. If it's a PDF file, there's actually pagination, so you can see the whole document and read the whole document directly on the repository. There's a number of previewer tools. I'm just showing you one of them right now. Next. GeoJSON is the next previewer for geospatial files, so that's also available. So when I think about climate data, this will be absolutely something that will be useful for the type of data that you are planning to share. Next. So this is a data explorer tool created by Scholars Portal. We're actually in version 2, so it's going to be a different preview, but it allows you to run analysis and visualization directly on the Dataverse platform. So those tabular files that I showed you earlier, those are the type of files that work with this Data Explorer tool. So your SPSS files, your Stata files, your R files, your CSV files, Excel files, when they're converted to a tabular format, you will have the ability to do this visualizations and analysis directly on the Dataverse platform. Next. Just to give you a visual of the embargo feature, this is one of our collections that that uses the embargo feature quite often, and they go from embargo to restricted, and then they go from embargo to open. So you have both options with the embargo feature. Gives you a lot of control over your data. And the next one, please. So just keep in mind that when you publish a data set and it's been accessed, you cannot delete it. What we do in the data publishing world is we deaccession the data set, because your citation needs to remain in case someone has used your data and they need to find that citation, that DOI. So we get a tombstone page, okay? And that's what's available. When somebody comes to the website, they cannot view your files. They can only view the tombstone page. As the owner of that data set, when you come in, you'll be able to see the files, but nobody else will be able to see it. Okay. I'm actually going to, because of the time, Danielle, I think I'm going to skip some of the considerations. I've already talked about sensitive data and some of our policies, because I would like Julie to have time to talk about the NIH DMP. So
Sounds
Julie,
good.
go right ahead. Yeah, go to the NIH DMP, because I've touched on most of everything here.
Great, that sounds good. Thanks, Sonia.
Yep.
Yeah, so we wanted to quickly talk about the importance of kind of the data sharing policies that we know are becoming more prevalent, and especially because CAFE is an NIH funded funding opportunity grant, we should focus on the requirements of the NIH. So just to start off with just putting data sharing in context, we're just highlighting a recent report by Digital Science on the concept of, open data. So we know that there are more and more policies and mandates that require data archiving as a condition of funding or even publication. So we can see that there has been a positive shift from this report, when 4 out of 5 researchers say that they are in favor of more data sharing, data becoming open as a common practice. And we even saw some sentiments of this shared during a session yesterday when we talked about data sharing. So quickly, I'll just go over the highlights of the NIH data management and sharing policy. So this new policy went into effect last year, and it now requires all grant applications seeking NIH funds that will generate scientific research data to submit this 2-page data management and sharing plan about how the data will be managed and shared throughout the entire project. So plans will have to include where, how, and when the data will be shared. And NIH is strongly encouraging the use of established repositories like Dataverse that Sonia just reviewed for us. And then, of course, researchers will have to comply with the approved plan and communicate any changes throughout the project. Here is a quick view of the elements that must be included in this data management and sharing plan. I'm not going to go through these right now, but we're going to come back to them. But they are the key 6 elements that make up these data management and sharing plans. So NIH is encouraging researchers to select data repositories that exemplify a specific set of what they've called desired characteristics. A lot of those characteristics have been outlined by Sonia already when she talked about the Dataverse platform. And these repository features really aim to ensure that data are managed and shared in ways that are consistent with those FAIR principles that Sonia also outlined. So we're just providing these links to resources created by NIH that can be helpful when selecting a repository. Again, I'll just emphasize something Sonia already mentioned is that researchers should use and locate those domain or data type specific repositories first, and then turn to these more open generalist repositories. So we just have some 2 quick, visual slides here for you to understand the larger landscape of data sharing and data repositories. So we know this is, a vast and evolving area. I think with the NIH policy, we'll see a lot more kind of domain and data type specific repositories being spun up for communities, which is wonderful. But in general, we see this larger, data sharing ecosystem having these 3 main types of repositories or places for sharing data. So NIH does support many repositories for the sharing of certain data types or domains of research. So we know there are repositories, for sequence data, for protein structures, et cetera, and even in disciplines for cancer immunology. And even specific NIH institutes or centers often have their own designated repository as well. The one that comes to mind is the National Institute of Mental Health has their own data archive. So again, those domain-specific repositories are a great first choice for researchers. You may also want to investigate at your institution if you have an institutional repository. Many institutional repositories are actually using the Dataverse software as their institutional repository. Those are a great place to find related institutional data. And then, of course, are these generalist repositories. So you can see the Dataverse project is one of these generalist repositories. These platforms take any type of data, a variety of data types, disciplines, domains, et cetera. And one thing that we did want to highlight is that Dataverse Harvard Dataverse is a member of the NIH Generalist Repository Ecosystem, or the GRAY initiative. You may have heard of this. And it's really providing funding for this better interoperability and co-opetition between these 7 generalist repositories listed on the slide, paving a way for large-scale improvements in data publishing and data sharing. And I'll quickly say this, but I'll let Sonia jump in if she has anything else to say on this. But you may be wondering, well, what's the difference between the Dataverse project and the Harvard Dataverse repository? So the Dataverse project is that open source web application that was created to help researchers share and preserve their research data. So this was that software that was developed in 2006, and it's now used by 100 installations around the world. So Harvard Dataverse is this data repository, a specific installation of the Dataverse software at Harvard University at IQSS. However, it is also open and free to any researcher, regardless of affiliation. So hopefully you can understand the difference between the platforms there. So as a kind of a gray repository and an NIH recognized and supported repository to align with the NIH data management and sharing policy, the Harvard Dataverse, as well as our companions at other repositories, have created guidance for researchers planning to use the repository to share data. So overall, researchers should, consider using a combination of repository features and data sharing good practices to address the elements of a data management and sharing plan. I suggest, when planning for data management and sharing, it is a good practice to review repository requirements and work them into your data workflows throughout the project. So therefore, when it comes time to share, you will be prepared and set up for that smooth deposit. You will also be in compliance with both the NIH and any repository requirements. So a lot of what Harvard Dataverse supports, Sonia has already covered, but I'll quickly walk through this guidance and the 6 elements of the plan so you can see some examples you can use in your data management and sharing plan. So that first element, data types, as we know, the Harvard Dataverse repository supports any format. Any data format, regardless of file extension. And Sonia talked about some additional processing of tabular data. So that might be really, crucial for you when picking a certain repository. Your plan should include, what types of data you'll be working with, particularly those file types and sizes. So notice in our example here, it includes migrating those file types to those open formats for long-term access and preservation, and also where and how that related any related documentation files will be maintained throughout the project, I should say. For the second element on related tools, software, and code, Harvard Dataverse repository accepts and encourages the deposit of research software and code produced to analyze data. So one example of this is to connect a GitHub repository to your Dataverse project, packaging all the data files and code files together. The cafe actually highly recommends and encourages you to do this as well. This is because publishing your software code in this way, as opposed to just linking to a GitHub repository, is more consistent with those FAIR principles. Again, GitHub is it's an awesome collaborative platform for working on code. It is not designed for preservation. Again, it's ultimately a commercial product. We don't know the preservation policy of GitHub, right? Remember, we want a unique identifier, a DOI, that long-term access, versioning, and metadata documentation. So putting your GitHub code into your Dataverse collection really enhances that and makes it more, as I said, fair and compliant. So onto element 3, this is where we get into a lot of that metadata and the standards that Sonia talked about. So again, the Harvard Dataverse repository, the data set contains 3 levels of metadata: that's citation, the domain-specific metadata, and file-level metadata. So while there are no requirements for data formatting, we're really recommending that researchers consult standards, like the NIH common data elements to support data comparison and aggregation, and use file formats that are common for the data type and disciplinary community. So additionally, we have those custom metadata blocks that can be created and tailored for specific data types. So you'll see within the cafe collections and files using such blocks like that computational workflow metadata, metadata about data location, and geospatial information will be key as well. All right, on to element 4. So this has to do with preservation, access, and associated timelines. So the Harvard Dataverse repository preservation policy outlines not only the repositories, but the governing institutions, Harvard's commitment to digital archiving and backup of all repository content. So this commitment is crucial when evaluating potential repositories to support your work. Access to data files is open by default. But again, Sonia talked about some of that mediated access that can be applied to your collection. If you will be using any mediated access to your data, you must just state that in your plan in plain language. And then in element 4, you have to include the name. Just include the name of any repository or repositories that you will be using. So we have provided just clear language, overview information that you can include about using Harvard Dataverse. And again, you shouldn't name just one, or if you're just using one, that's great. But if you are using multiple repositories for your different data types within your project, you just name all the repositories and align those repository names with the data types that will be shared in those locations. For element 5, this gets into that access, distribution, and reuse. So these are, again, managed by authors on a per data set, per file basis, using a combination of software features, including that licensing, embargoes, terms of use, and file restrictions. So you can, again, see the example language that we've included here, using, the CC0 public domain license, how people can get access to the data. Again, if you will be restricting access, you just want to outline, and again, plain language, exactly how one can get access to any data files that are available. Again, this section may be used to address any sensitive information or data that you have collected and either can and cannot share. Again, Dataverse is not suitable for sensitive data sharing, but you could use some of those features that Sonia talked about, and having the data located elsewhere and having a metadata record within the Harvard Dataverse to point to where that person could get access to that data. All right, and then finally with element 6, which is oversight of data management. So Harvard Dataverse repository user accounts can be granted those roles that Sonia went through. This can help define, which actions they are allowed to take on, the collection, on data sets, on files. So you may want to think about in this section outlining exactly who will be responsible for different permissions and actions within the Dataverse collection when it comes time to sharing. So in element 6, you're just outlining who is responsible for data management sharing. Harvard Dataverse itself is not a responsible party that may be named in your plan. So therefore, you really want to rely on your project team members overseeing the Dataverse, creation and deposit and et cetera. However, you may want to use, as we're pointing out in our example text here, you may want to use the curation services that are available through Dataverse, and those can be listed in your plan. So one final piece of that NIH data management and sharing policy is that investigators can request funds for this work, for data management and sharing. We know this is it takes a lot of effort, takes a lot of time, takes expertise. So NIH is recognizing that you may want to pay someone who has that expertise to help you out. So that's where Dataverse can come in and help you with some of these allowable costs, such as, curating the data, helping you prepare metadata, that de-identification work, and even large data set support which I see Sonia is talking about in the chat a little bit. So to help with kind of, budgeting and understanding, how much money should I budget for data management and sharing, Harvard Dataverse does have some curation services, and this chart helps you breaks down what those costs would be. And these are available for both Harvard and non-Harvard researchers. You can just see the costs there. If you do want to use these services when contributing to the CAFE collection, our understanding is you will still have to budget for these services on your individual projects. But know that, there are experts out there to help you, do this work and ensure that you are sharing really robust data sets. All right, last two resources last resource that I want to point out can be found on that CAFE data management function collection. So we've already seen the CAFE Dataverse collection, and we're really encouraging the community to contribute to that collection. Additionally, as has been talked about throughout the conference already, we've also established a community GitHub organization to share code, examples, and tutorials when working with common data formats and sources. And we're also continually creating standard operating procedures for that data processing, integration, and analysis. And then all of these, so the Dataverse collection, the GitHub, the SOPs, these really facilitate reproducibility and reusability for climate and health data, the large goal of this project. So the last kind of arrow there on the slide, that resource I want to point out is another resource that you can use when crafting your data management and sharing plans. This document kind of combines the key data management and sharing elements we have already reviewed. So we reviewed the NIH data management and sharing policy. We reviewed the Harvard Dataverse guidance, and now we're applying kind of the CAFE lens to this guidance. So this document aligns your project directly with CAFE while in compliance with those NIH policies and alignment with the Harvard Dataverse requirements. So you are really encouraged to, copy paste this language and use it in your plans. However, with any, copy paste, there's always a caveat. Please, please, please just review what you are copying and ensure that it does actually align with your individual research. I cannot tell you how many times I have been reviewing these data management and sharing plans, seeing copied elements from some NIH example out there that actually does not really align with the project. So just understand, what you're getting into when, submitting data to a CAFE collection, to the Harvard Dataverse repository. That's awesome. But we want to set you up for success in offering these, documents and this guidance for you. So again, that you have that smooth journey through data planning, data collection, and data deposit into Harvard Dataverse. So I think that kind of ends our presentation slides for you here. We will make these available to conference attendees in some way, but we leave you with lots of resources. And yeah, thank you all for attending and your time and attention.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you, Sonia. We have a few more minutes if there are any questions. Some of them have been already answered in the chat. Maybe I just want to add that one of our goals in CAFE is really to facilitate the sharing and reuse of climate change and health data. When we were thinking about how to do this, we did do kind of a review of existing repositories, and we identified this gap in the community. We don't really have a place to come together and share data that's specific to climate change and health. And that's where we proposed partnering with Harvard Dataverse and Sonia and Julie to come together and create this collection for CAFE. In terms of what the collection includes right now and what it will include in the future, we really need your input. The plan is for the CAFE team to kind of curate commonly used data sets in this space. We'll be sending out a survey to all emails from PubMed publications related to climate change and health in the last few years. So you might get that survey in terms of trying to understand priorities of what data set the CAFE team should curate. But in addition to the CAFE team actually curating and depositing data, the hope is that all of us as a community come together and start depositing data sets as well, so that, again, we can grow this collection. Sonia gave a great example of a different collection that had many data sets. So we hope that this is a resource that will be useful for the entire community. So that's kind of the plan, and we're very interested in your input in terms of, again, prioritizing the types of data sets that we want to deposit. One thing to note is we're not planning to copy over like raw data sets from other sources. So if data is already hosted on federal or government websites, we're not planning to copy it over. This is supposed to be a space where we can deposit kind of data that has been processed or manipulated in a way, again, or hasn't been actually deposited somewhere else. So one example you can look in our Dataverse right now is wildfire PM, which we aggregated to the zip code level. So that's data that the raw data source was not available at the zip code level. But here, this will save a lot of people effort in terms of redoing these aggregations. And I think we're right out time. We're happy to continue these conversations in the Huvo platform, and please feel free to reach out to any of us. And thank you so much for attending this almost last session. There's one more wrap-up session after this, so we hope to see you there. Thank you.
Thanks.